All right, everybody, we'll get going in about 5 seconds. Just wait a moment until everything starts to record. All right, okay. All right, my name is Charles Nebeze, and I'm the Vice President of Business Development and Commercialization with the Center for Excellence in Mining Innovation. And I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. Today, we're going to be hosting Neil Milton, who's going to be speaking to us about intellectual property and all the things that we must know about intellectual property in order for us to be as competitive as we can. And before we jump into the presentation, I want to give you a bit of an outline on how this will proceed. If you have any questions, please feel free to type your questions inside the chat box. And what Neil will do is he'll read those questions and he'll try and give an answer to your questions the best he can during the time we have allotted. And we expect to go to about 2 o'clock or so for questions. And then what will happen is after the presentation is over, we're going to provide you a copy of this presentation via a YouTube link, and also a copy of the presentation that is going to be provided. Okay, but before we have Neil speak to us, I would like to introduce everybody here to Douglas Morrison, the President and CEO for the Center for Excellence in Mining Innovation. And Douglas is going to start off with some opening remarks. Over to you, Douglas.
Okay, thank you very much, Charles. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank NRCan for inviting SEMI to advance the commercialization of innovation in the mineral processing sector. SEMI has long recognized that closing the knowledge gap between mining and mineral processing is critically important to the future of innovation within the industry. And we also know that the jurisdictions that are very good at mobilizing and capturing IP will secure a leadership position in the sector. So Canada is poised to secure such a leadership role in the mining sector if we can help you, the attendees, to find better ways to mobilize and capture your IP. And so this effort here is part of the work we're doing for NRCan and their Impact Challenge program and the Crush It program in particular. Second, I'd like to thank Mr. Neil Milton. First of all, for the discussions that we at SEMI have had with him over the last few weeks. We found it very helpful for ourselves, and we're in complete agreement with him that controlling your own IP is very important for the future of your businesses. It's especially important for attracting capital to grow your business. Open innovation is not very attractive to investors. And so Neil is going to talk to us all about the importance of retaining intellectual property and how vitally important it is for your company's future. By the end of the presentation, I expect you'll have a much better understanding of all the options you have to capture IP, and he will have clarified the 4 most important misconceptions and misunderstandings about IP. These are, first, that it's not all about patents. There are several options, including trademarks and copyrights, and he'll talk about those. Second, the idea that it's very expensive. It isn't. Some protections like copyright or trademark are very inexpensive, and even patent applications are not that expensive in the first couple of years. Third, that it's difficult to do, and it isn't. Again, this is not true. Some things are very easy to do, like the trademarks and copyright, and even with patents, there are people out there that can help you with that at a very, very low cost. And finally, some people think that it's not important because it's always possible for larger companies to get around your IP provisions. And again, this is not true. And capturing IP is actually one of the most important things you can do to build your company and to build your company's brand. And it's one of the most cost beneficial things that you can do to secure the future of your company. And with that, I will hand it over to the expert, Neil Milton. And here he is. Off you go. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. This is going to be a very brief and hurried run through, but I hope it engages some further discussions for you on IP and how it can be useful for your business. So the agenda is really to talk very briefly about the key forms of intellectual property. And then I'm going to try to salt through the conversation some considerations that are relevant to the mining and mineral processing industries. But you can start in a sense right there with one of the key misconceptions is the notion that intellectual property is only for and all about high tech. That couldn't be more wrong. In many respects, IP is of greatest value for businesses that don't think of themselves as high tech and aren't changing extraordinarily quickly. So don't think of it that this isn't relevant to me or this isn't relevant to my industry. It is, and hopefully I'll give you some ideas about how you can take advantage of it to grow your business. So the core IP rights fall into these 5 categories: patents, trademarks, copyrights, industrial designs, and trade secrets. The difference between the first 4 and the last is whether they are rights that once you get them apply against the world. That's true for the first 4. The trade secret rights primarily are only protectable against your counterparty to a contract. So the first are true property rights. Just as you could exclude someone from your physical property, you can exclude anyone, whether you've met them or not, from your IP, your intellectual property rights. Trade secret protection is a little bit different in that it relies on the enforcement of contract rights, and it had to be baked into contracts that you have with the opposing party. So let's dive right into patents. They're in some respects the best known, the sexiest. They're by no means your only option. As Doug was mentioning, patents protect invention. So this is truly in the concept of, have I had a new or novel idea about a way to do something? However, they're not necessarily the big overarching invention that you first think of as the root and branch of an industry. Often the most valuable inventions are incremental improvements. Something that produces 5 or 10% greater efficiency can often be of greater value because you don't have to do the missionary work of getting people to adopt the core idea, and they're all very excited to adopt this incremental improvement that saves them time or money or something of that nature. It can be, a patent can apply to a product, a process, machine, or a composition. So compositions are interesting. Processes are very interesting. Don't think of it just about light bulbs. It can be the way of making light bulbs. It can be the way of treating discharge or effluent. It can be the mechanism for treating the effluent, but it doesn't have to be. So they do incur significant costs. As Doug mentioned, these done strategically, you can spend those costs over a significant period of time. I like to think of a patent filing as a call option on rights. And what you want to do is get your stake in the ground, maybe a bit like prospecting. You want to get your stake in the ground and then find out if anyone wants to finance this thing or whether it's viable. And so you can control your spend over time as long as you're very, very attentive to what rights you're securing. Now, one of the key reverse things that many, many people who are new to IP forget is how useful other people's patents can be to you, and also they can be scary. So you have to protect your own inventions quickly if you want to ever secure any protection. And the real rule of thumb is file an application, probably a provisional patent application in the United States, before you disclose the invention to anyone outside who isn't under an obligation of confidence. Don't go to a trade show and have your new invention on a poster and start yakking about it until you filed an application, one application first. So that's an absolutely crucial rule. You must file before you disclose. Flipping it on its head, you must be sensitive to other people's patent rights. And it's important to make to consider that you're not infringing previously protected matter. And the third consideration, though, which is probably the least well understood, is what a gold mine, literally, of useful information other people's prior patent filings are. They give you insight about people's what's been done in the past. Often those patent rights have expired. Maybe they never even applied in Canada. So for instance, someone applied in the United States, never applied in Canada. It's fair game. And you can learn everything you can learn from reading their patent. It gives you insight into who's doing what in an industry. So a decent patent landscape report will advise you who else is doing work in your field. Maybe you want to collaborate, maybe it's an indication of who you need to be worried about. But I strongly encourage you to think about the idea of mining the database of patents, of other people's patents, both to protect yourself from infringing other people and to leapfrog and accelerate your own innovation process. If they're free and available for reading by anyone and everyone. So happy to talk more about patents. They are, as I say, the sexy part of the innovation game. They can be extraordinarily powerful, but they have to be used with great care, or you can spend a lot of money and accomplish very little. Trademarks. Trademarks are, in some respects, the complete inverse. Trademark is a name, logo, slogan that protects your brand, your mark, and it distinguishes your products and goods and services from those of others. It's an indicator of origin for consumers, and it protects consumers from confusion. They can last essentially indefinitely if you keep maintaining them. They're very cost effective to acquire, and they're massively powerful. Now, the power really relates to the protecting your brand. If your brand isn't very worthwhile or considered very highly, then you haven't protected very much. But the two concepts lean on each other. The IP protection is what makes it possible for you to know when I say, let's get a cat or a bobcat, that those are two quite different things. But everybody recognizes those names, and though the name alone is of enormous value in securing people buying your product and paying high margins for it. And if you ever have any doubt about the value of trademarks, I encourage you to go to your local pharmacy, your local Shoppers Drug Mart, and just compare the cost of Tylenol to the acetaminophen beside it. It's probably 50% to 100% more. That's the value of one trademark. And that doesn't include the fact that you'll see a whole list of other Tylenol cold and flu stuff that actually has nothing to do with acetaminophen, really. But the power of trademarks in getting people to buy from a trusted source is massive. You have to be trusted, but equally, it's a way a small company often gets built into RFPs, gets recognized and gets hired quickly, avoiding the classic sort of tender race to the bottom. Let's talk about copyrights. Copyrights arise automatically. Don't need to file anything, don't need to spend a lot of money, but they protect creative works. So it has to be something new and original, but not very. It protects the phone book. So it protects things that you have developed against copying by someone else. Someone else can rewrite the phone book or rewrite a novel that has boy meets girl, girl meets boy, they fall in love, but you can't substantially reproduce someone else's. It's obviously what protects music, movies, art, but in the business world, it's also remarkably valuable for protecting things like software, marketing collaterals, manuals, websites, things of that nature, from other people copying them. Though in the case of software, and whether it's software as a service or whether you're providing enterprise software or firmware, the copyright is the principal value of your business, but in other areas, it's also extremely useful, say often in protecting against things like gray market goods, people who buy your product in one jurisdiction and try to sell it in another. If you've protected the manuals, may be a very useful way to try to shut them down quickly and efficiently. Very important in the case of copyright, but it's true with all intellectual property like patents as well, to ensure that you have good written agreements with everyone who's involved in the creation process. So whether that's your marketing person or your graphic designer, your coders, especially true in the copyright world is that often people are working with contractors rather than employees. Very important to have proper paperwork. Doesn't have to be long, doesn't have to be complex, but it needs to be in writing and clear that the creator is assigning the copyright to the payor, to the business. Industrial designs. Industrial designs are a lot like patents. In fact, in some places, China and the United States, they're called design patents. They're called industrial design rights in Europe and in Canada. They're similar to patents in that you should file prior to disclosure. There are some exceptions, but don't count on them. The real rule of thumb, again, is when you have something new and original, file the design application before disclosing to third parties, anyone outside the business. And these secrecy requirements are very strict. Disclosure to anyone can kill your rights. Industrial designs are used to protect the non-functional aesthetic features of your design. So people have become much, much more attentive to design in recent years, I think largely instigated by Apple. They're not something you would normally think of a lot in the industrial world, but there can be surprisingly useful. So while they're more obviously applicable to things like furniture and jewelry and light fixtures, for instance, but just to give you an example, in the car industry, the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, have made very aggressive use of industrial design protection as a way of protecting the aftermarket parts business. So that in order to buy a Mercedes-Benz mud flap at some obscene cost, instead of buying a knockoff at Canadian Tire, if you want it to look right, you have the aesthetic features of it, and those are often protected by industrial design rights. So I suspect, for instance, if you go looking at that Caterpillar has probably done the same thing with some of its things that might not jump out at you as being particularly innovative or artistic, but they do have non-functional aesthetic features that distinguish them from the pure functional activity. Trade secrets. So trade secrets can protect any commercially valuable information. And so essentially the key thing there is if it's valuable, it can be protected and enforced. But it has to be done through contract. It can be, it's inexpensive in the sense that the contracts don't cost you a lot of money or government fees to protect and file, as might be the case with patents. They're expensive in the sense that you have to be very vigilant internally to ensure that you secure contracts with people that matter and that you retain them. A colleague used to refer to it as contract hygiene. You have to ensure that you get them signed and you keep a copy of them and that you can find it when you need it in order to remind someone of the obligations that they owe you. Mentioned before, one of the weaknesses potentially is they can only be enforced against the counterparty to the contract normally. they can be, if an employee jumps ship, you can, and moves to a competitor, you can probably enforce the trade secret rights against the competitor as well, because they would be acquiring the information improperly in breach of the contract. But what you can't do is use it to protect against a third party who you've never met, who's never met you, and who comes up with the same idea, for instance, independently. And that's the difference, this independent creation. Independent creation doesn't protect you in the world of copyrights. You can go out tomorrow and rewrite the code for Twitter and produce the same application. But whereas patents do protect you against third-party independent creation of the same idea. So let's talk just ever so briefly about some of the relevant considerations in the mining and mineral processing world. So starting with the negative, then it's important at least to be brutally honest about how difficult it can be sometimes to identify what, if you have intellectual properties, whether someone else is infringing them. You know, if you have a patent on a process for mapping out mines, and they happen to be underground, you're going to have great difficulty determining if third parties are using your technology from afar. And in addition to the fact that they're hidden often, very often, they're obviously going to be in very remote locations, often in very different countries. Many of these rights, you have to think about acquiring them in different countries, and then the secondary obstacle of enforcing them in each country. And obviously, many places where at least the first order mining and processing is taking place are not the places that would leap to mind as a place to start enforcing rights and to sue people. But and equally, you may end up having to think about selling in many different places. But there are ways to mitigate these risks. And clearly, in particular, is to think about, if you're doing business with a party who may be thinking about infringing, they may have operations in a place that's much easier to enforce. You may have a ways of getting at them in the United States or in the UK, for instance, even in South Africa, where many people would find it much more likely that the courts are going to give you fair redress. But on the positive side, the crucial thing about all IP doesn't suddenly give you this tidal tsunami of money. You know, you don't protect some little thing and suddenly become wealthy. The important thing to think about it is it a key that unlocks some greater value? And then how do I share that value and capture for myself some of it? Not all of it, some of it. Because the sharing needs to take place between the innovator, the deployer, and the customer. And to mix my metaphors, it may have opened the door, the key that opens the door. How do you take advantage of getting through that door and making more high margin sales that don't necessarily involve you selling around the world in a massive fashion, but it takes your business to the next level? One of the key things to think about in the context of IP is how often it's useful as a way to enable other people to make money, and that you can take your idea and your innovation to a third party who in turn can use their distribution channels, their distribution muscle to sell more stuff in one fashion or another, and share the benefits with you and with their customers. Often that's best done with someone who's not the end user. So often you, for instance, might have an innovative product or process that someone who's a much more of a bigger service company can take to market and sell wrap around the innovation a whole suite of services that for them are what they're looking to sell. And they just leave back for you your contribution, whether it's goods or services that you can make money on, but you've made them the winner of in selling their thing. So that is something that IP facilitates in a way that people tend to have a mistaken understanding and think that they have to be extraordinarily protective. The point is, once you've protected, most of the time it allows you to be very open and to think then about approaching other people. And if they don't want to participate with you, you can say, well, thank you very much, and go somewhere else. And ideally, they're not in a position to take what was yours because you've properly protected it before you initiated that discussion. Yeah, don't fall in the trap of thinking that you must sell your product to reap your invention, the benefits from your invention. Often, in fact, it's you take your invention to a third party. I'm trying to think of a great example, but even if you, for instance, came up with a better golf club tomorrow, it's rare that the business, you would suddenly think, oh, I want to suddenly become a golf club manufacturer. It's not, most of the life is not like Dragon's Den. What you should be doing is, I've had a better idea for a golf club. Now I go to Callaway. Now I go to Top Flight. Now I go to the other people who have the muscle, and I say, who wants to dance with me? Because they have the ability to monetize your invention in a way that you don't in any reasonably foreseeable time frame. So always consider licensing. Consider, that slide should also include, consider partnering. You may be able to provide a few days of extremely valuable consulting services and products, and someone else sells hundreds or thousands of days of services wrapped around it. If you have a better, smarter way of treating effluent, you probably don't want to be selling to every mine and every mining company everywhere. But there are lots of engineering companies who might be very interested in winning competitive bids to deal with effluent better than their competitors. And so you need to go to one or two of them and convince them that you have a way of helping them. And that, I say, is a crucial thing that IP enables. Doesn't solve the problem, but makes it much easier to deal with, is that you can go to third parties and help them achieve greater sales to their customers. Right. Questions, Charles? Where are we at? We're at 2 o'clock.
Awesome, thank you. So there are a couple of questions, Neil, in the chat box. So I'm going to let you read those questions in the chat box. I don't know if you see it, and
No,
allow you. Okay, so if you look at the bottom,
here, I got it.
Yeah, but there was a request by a gentleman by the name of Daniel Clough to ask a question online, and I can enable him to ask that question if that's okay with you, Neil.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, Daniel, I'll just queue up in a second. Okay, give me one moment. I need to find your name on my long list of names here. Okay. Maybe in the meantime, Neil, if you can look at the questions that have been asked already, is there any one question you want to pick out while I get Daniel ready?
So let me start with the what countries do you want to file a patent in? So let me give you an example from semiconductors. If you're in Canada, you come up with a better semiconductor design, don't file in Canada, because no one makes semiconductors in Canada. Where do you want to file? Taiwan. Maybe, however, you want to file in the United States because you think that people will import from Taiwan or Japan into the United States. So you want to file in the jurisdiction where the product or the invention is going to be worked, so used, or where you want to be able to get at products that infringe. But so you need to know the specifics of your product and your industry and then work backwards from that to think about where are the fewest jurisdictions that I can choke off a competitor from beating me. So to use my semiconductor example, pretty much if you file in Japan and Taiwan, you've choked off the world's supply of high-end semiconductors. That's it. You don't need to go anywhere else because no one makes them anywhere else. And so in many industries, you'd be surprised at how few places, if you really think about it, you need to go. But obviously, if you're happen to be more like pharmaceuticals, then you're stuck. You have to think seriously about, do you want to file everywhere? And if so, what is it going to cost me to do that? Best database for patents is the European Patent Office. And it's more easily searched than the others. It's free. I'm sorry, I don't have the URL handy, but if you search European Patent Database, you should land on it. And if not, send me an email and I'll send you the link. Excellent resource. And say it's really shocking to me in an industry like mining and mineral processing in particular. Things often move very slowly, and the thinking that someone engaged in 20, 30, 50 years ago might be very relevant to where you could move forward from now, especially since innovations that may not have been commercially viable might now be commercially viable to work on because of cheaper electronics, because of software, and because of the internet that weren't when they were first thought of. So I really strongly encourage you to think about looking at other people's filings to get you when you're working on something. Google Patents is also is pretty good. Yes, it's a SPASnet. That's it. Absolutely, that's the best source.
Yeah, I'll just enable Daniel to ask his question now. One moment.
Yep.
Go ahead, Daniel, and unmute yourself.
Thank you, Charles. Thanks for the discussion. Interesting information you're giving us. I have you on two screens. That's why I'm looking at you, but my camera's over there. So we've done our patent, and now we've done a PCT. So far, we're in for about 25 grand on this, and nothing has actually happened yet, except exactly as you say, the whole business of non-disclosure and non-competition agreements is less important when we're trying to get a partner with this, right? And this is in mining, so we want them to call us. We want to advertise, but the thing that's coming up now is we have to select the countries out of the PCT that we want to try to operate in. Each one of those has an individual fee. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is the freedom to operate search. So that's a big cost in itself, isn't it? It depends on how much comes up, or I don't know. That's where I don't have experience in. And the problem then becomes we might have to license from someone who had some other patent that's nested within this.
Precisely. So a patent isn't a license. I can go out and patent an improvement to an iPhone tomorrow, but it doesn't give me the right to make iPhones.
No, right.
So, and in fact, the obvious only buyer or licensee of my idea is going to be Apple. So, in a sense, freedom to operate, which I was touching on in the concept of find out what other people are doing in the infringement, is really quite unrelated to your own idea, other than, and your own patent absolutely does not give you a license to work it. You have an invention, you can prevent people from using your idea, but you don't have the right to use your idea if it can only be worked by you infringing someone else's patents. And that happens a lot. One of the things that patents reveal that most people are not maybe as aware of as they should be is how much every innovation stands on the shoulders of many, many other predecessors.
Yeah.
many of which may still be live. Now, and one thing, however, to consider is always this notion of, well, are the patent rights that I might infringe, are they live in the jurisdictions that I care about? So for instance, they may have only filed in the United States. That's a very common sort of an American thing. And you'd be surprised at how often they didn't bother to file in Canada, for instance. So your freedom to operate gets much easier. But your month 30 problem of suddenly shooting out of the PCT process, and now you have to file for all these national phase, is exactly the problem. You have to run fast. You need to have a business case lined up for what you're doing at month 30. And ideally, you have a pretty good idea of that by month 18. Because by the time you're at month 29, it's too late to figure out other than just, and what most people do, I've learned a little bit about human nature, is once a train leaves the station, they find it extraordinarily difficult not to keep spending money. But you have to be ruthless and take some gambles. One of the gambles that is often much more worthwhile than people realize is that they end up having future improvements to their own invention. And the product or service that ends up being the most value was not the thing they filed for the first time, or that they thought it was the first time. And so you'd be surprised at how often you can get away with letting go of some of the rights on the first patent if you make subsequent improvements to the same. If you're getting a business going, you're going to keep innovating in the same field. But it is, look, it is absolutely the challenge. You have to be ready for the fact that there will be some big bills. And when you start thinking about places like Japan and Korea and China, the translation fees alone are thousands of dollars per country. So you need to be, it will be problematic. I think personally that patent strategy is more important than most people realize, and it's more important than getting the just file and forget, which is a very common entrepreneurial approach. There's a question. Sorry, did that help? Did I answer anything usefully?
Yeah, thank you, Neil, for that. No, I think you did answer his question, and he did have a follow-up of
so
you at the time as well.
Let me try a couple of these others. So the patent filing process, look, is you need to file the application before there's disclosure of the invention, essentially anywhere in the world. There's an exemption in Canada and the United States for inventors. You have up to 12 months from first disclosure to file, but now you've restricted yourself to only getting patent rights in Canada and the United States. You're dead, for instance, in China and in Europe. So you need to file first before you make any disclosure. There's a whole series of events. People in the patent business tend to think of them and talk about them in months. So if you file at month 0, if you make any disclosures, you must do something by month 12. Normally what you do at month 12 is you file what's called a PCT application. That's a patent cooperation treaty filing. And then at month 30, you're going to go into every jurisdiction in the world that you want to file in, whether it's Europe, the United States, China, Japan, Korea, and all of Latin America, for instance. So Brazil, wherever you're going. So it's very important. And in that interim period, you will get some decent information from the patent office as to the quality of your patent and the likelihood that you're going to succeed. And it's very, very worthwhile front-end loading some money to get an examination of your patent done, to get an idea of how broad the claims are going to be. Patents are in a very arcane world in which the legal rights all depend on a few words on a piece of paper that almost no one can understand until they're litigated. So it's a very, but it's very important to follow that process. You can see on my website or one of my websites, there's a bunch of ebooks and handouts on the time frame and on the process. It's also discussed in the Dummies book. This licensing question, well, do you start at a conservative price and scale it out? That entirely depends on your clients and your customers and your bargaining power. What we've seen in the software world in this last decade, of course, of everything is freemium models. So you get people hooked on something for free, and then you try to have a model in which you add some extra features that some people will pay for. Zoom being a good example of that. Doesn't tend to work as well in the commercial world. I'm a fan of trying to, but pricing strategy is not IP strategy. So you need to have a pricing strategy for your product and services that you can make some early sales, find out how much value you're adding to people, and then try to figure out how you can convince them that paying more or less is really beneficial to their business.
Neil, if I can just jump in with another question. One of the questions that I've got here through private messages, what is the value in looking at expired patents and also withdrawn patents? Can maybe just comment on those two things?
Yeah, ideas and ideas that can be picked up for free. So it's amazing how many people end up reinventing the wheel because they didn't go off and find out what other people have done to challenge the same on the same or similar problems in the past. And remember, go back to, didn't talk very much about what makes something patentable, but it has to be new and not obvious. And not obvious means not obvious to a person of ordinary skill in the art. So if your business is refining, the person of ordinary skill in the art is not me or someone just off the street. It's someone who's also in the refining of our business, somewhat similar to your own. And even, for instance, there's a tendency to think, well, no one's done exactly what I'm talking about. Yes, but in the patent world, if someone's done it with one thing and it's obvious to try it with yours, then yours is not patentable. And so, but reversing that, Charles, to your point is, look, there's an awful lot of information in especially in old expired patents about things that people have tried. And you can then get an idea about what they've tried, what's worked, what's not worked, in a way that, it's a reservoir of information about technical problems, not necessarily scientific problems. It's people's attempts to solve problems and commercialize them. I'll give you an example. I did some work a little while ago about sticking labels. And so labels and how you put them on and put them on packaging. There are thousands of patents. So if you go to Staples and buy Avery labels, Avery is a good example of a company that split its IP apart from the selling of labels. So the company that owns all the patents is now separate from the company that makes labels that you can buy at Staples, because everything you go and buy these days has labels on it. But there's an enormous pile of patents about how to put labels onto products, how to do it when the products are crinkly, when they're not shaped properly. Like, you would not believe how much. So, however, if I wanted to get in the label business, I would start by reading a whole bunch of patents, because it would give me a pretty good idea of what other people have done to solve problems about how to put labels on at high speeds onto weird products. So it's this reservoir of other people's attempts to solve technical problems. And also, as you move forward in time to closer to today, it gives you an idea of who else is doing work in an area. So for instance, we did a freedom to operate opinion actually on related to canes. So a cane that a disabled person might use for walking. Dozens of patents owned by Honda. What? Well, it turns out Honda considers themselves in the personal mobility space. And I said to the client, well, so if you've got something here, have you thought about going and licensing the Honda? And it would just opened a whole new vista to him of who else might be in the business of thinking about personal mobility and how people get themselves around. So there's an example of fortuitous information. And then obviously there's if the patent is within the last 20 years, you need to figure out if it's expired or not. But the mere fact that you don't have freedom to operate without working them should not shut you down. You know, a lot of people immediately get despondent that I can't do what I want to do. Well, there's probably a good chance that the person who filed that application is either very open to new ideas and improving them, or is dead, or their business is moribund, or you can license from them and carry forward with it. Like, there are all kinds of things that are possible. So the mere fact that you hit something that looks like prior art that might hurt you is a reason to start digging deeper.
Excellent. All right. Thank you so much, Neil, for the presentation. And also thank you, Douglas, for those introductory remarks. I also want to thank the audience who are from actually a global audience we have here, and people from across Canada, from coast to coast. I want to just remind everybody that we will be sending you an email shortly requesting if you'd like to receive one of the intellectual property law for dummies books, if you have a Canadian mailing address. And we'll also be providing you a copy of the presentation YouTube link, so you can rewatch this with when you have more time on your hands. But again, thank you, Neil. Would you like to maybe just say some parting words before we end the presentation? Thank you.
Well, I think, as I said to you, Charles, this kind of seminar, I think, is an example of how IP should be much more on the minds of people in Canada and in industries like mining than it's been. But now you have an opportunity to get world-class IP advice in a way that might have been much, much more difficult in the past. No matter where you are, if you have an internet connection, you can get someone to give you good advice, and it should not cost you a fortune, at least to start to find out, is this something I want to pursue further? So it is an area that warrants learning a lot about. Don't spend 50,000, more than you spend on a car, on a patent, without knowing what PCT means.
Excellent. Gotcha. Thank you so much, Neil. And again, I think people are dropping off already. Thank you, everybody. We'll be in touch with you shortly. Have a good day. Thank you.